So in A Philosophy of Education, Charlotte Mason has a section starting on page 190 about composition. So I would highly recommend going back and reading through that. You can find her volumes for free on amblesideonline.org and or is it amblesideonline.org? It's one of those. But you can find them for free to read if you don't have them. But again, I think it's really key to go back and kind of see, okay, what did she actually have to say about teaching these subjects? Just to give you an idea so that you are kind of, always going back to her philosophy. I don't want ever to be like, what does Julie say? Or, I can only do, like, there's only one right or wrong way to kind of do this. It's not a box that you have to try to fit your family into, but I do think it's important to go back and say, okay, what did she have to say about this? So she says, composition in Form 1 is almost entirely oral. And then she says, in few things do certain teachers labor in vain more than in the careful and methodical way in which they teach composition to young children. The drill that these undergo in forming sentences is unnecessarily and stifling, as much so perhaps as drill would be in the acts, and I don't even know what these two words here, two big words. But she says, teachers err out of their exceeding goodwill and generous zeal. They feel that they cannot do too much for children and attempt to do for them those things which they are richly endowed to do for themselves. Among these is the art of composition, the art of telling, which accumulates in a Scott or a Homer and begins with toddling persons of 2 and 3 who talk a great deal to each other. So, teaching writing to young children, and I used to be an elementary school teacher, and we kind of have this idea of like, okay, well, our kids are such bad writers in high school and colleges. So the way that we get them to become better writers is we make them start writing sentences when they're 5. And then if we keep drilling this over and over and over again, surely by the time they graduate high school, they'll be excellent writers. But that's really not the way it works. And so she's saying, that this is like stultifies the child's ability to write on their own. And I've seen that for sure. The teachers end up having to do a lot of the work because it's not developmentally appropriate for young elementary students to be writing anyway. So here she's talking about this oral composition. And I think we need to realize that's what it is. If you look at English textbooks from like the early 1900s, for the elementary level, they have a subject called oral composition in them, that they realize that this is actually writing that the students are doing. They're not doing it with their hands, but they're doing it with their minds and their thoughts. So when your child's narrating to you, that's composing, right? Our ability to talk comes way before our ability to write. And so here she talks about Scott and Homer. Well, those amazing writers, they started out as 2 and 3-year-olds just talking, right? And so instead of stultifying that, valuing that and getting kids to express themselves more in that way is so important. And I think we can get anxious. Oh, they don't know how to write all this stuff yet. So, they're not writing paragraphs like the 3rd grader down the street. And so I need to give them pointers on how they should orally compose. And or I should teach them how to start writing their narrations earlier. But really that hampers their ability rather than letting it be a natural process here. And then she talks about as they get to be older, so like in Form 2, again, they're having this oral composition still. And she says, composition is not an adjunct, but an integral part of their education in every subject. So because they're narrating on every subject, they're really writing a lot. It may not be writing in a paragraph, but they're writing in that oral composition everything. So it's not like this separate subject that we have to wait until writing time to learn how to write. They're writing all day long in their way that they're expressing themselves through their narrations. She says, the exercise affords very great pleasure to the children. Perhaps we all like to tell what we know. And in proportion as their composition is entirely artless, it is in the same degree artistic. And any child is apt to produce a style to be envied for its vigor and grace. But let me again say, there must be no attempt to teach composition, Our failure as teachers is that we place too little dependence on the intellectual power of our scholars. And as they are modest little souls, what the teacher kindly volunteers to do for them, they feel they cannot do for themselves. But give them a fair field and no favor, and they will describe their favorite scene from the play that they have read, and much besides. So instead of, again, taking that away from them, letting them do that themselves. Now, that doesn't mean you can't like write down their narrations. That's not what she's saying, right? You're not composing that for them. They're composing it and you're just transcribing it. So that's different. But what I see is that students who have narrated for a very long time have, like she was saying here, an amazing artistry to their writing. They have their own voice. They're able to express their thoughts clearly and articulate, and it doesn't sound like a formula. So, like when I taught 5th grade in public school, we had to do the 5-paragraph essay, and it was terrible trying to like pulling teeth out of 10-year-old children to get them to write these 5 paragraphs, and they just, I mean, every once in a while, you'd have some kid who was like a really gifted writer, and theirs would probably turn out pretty good. But for the majority of the class, it would just not be good at all, because they were so trying to stick to this formula. They had no voice to their writing. Whereas kids who've talked and given narrations and made it their own for years and years and years, their writing is just really great. But then when they get to, she says in forms 3 and 4, then you can start, bringing in these composition lessons, which is why I bring in books that teach composition as they get older. In these forms, some definite teaching in the art of composition is advisable, but not too much, lest the young scholars be saddled with a stilted style, which may encumber them for life. Perhaps the method of a university tutor is the best that can be adopted. That is, a point or two may be given up in a composition, and suggestions or corrections made with little talk. Having been brought up so far upon stylists, the pupils are almost certain to have formed a good style. Because they have been thrown into the society of many great minds, they will not make a servile copy of anyone, but will shape an individual style out of the wealth of material they possess. And because they have matter in abundance and of the best, they will not write mere verbiage. And if you want some like really intimidating student samples, and a philosophy of education, she gives samples of kids' written narrations for different forms, which are quite impressive, I must say. Again, when they're in forms 3 or 4, that's when you're taking up points in their narrations, right? And helping them going through these corrections. Doesn't mean you correct the whole thing, right? You bring up 1 point each time they're writing it, and it has this cumulative effect overall.